The Battle of Cannae was a major battle of the Second Punic War that took place on the 2nd of August 216 BC in Apulia, in southeast Italy. The army of Carthage, under Hannibal, decisively defeated a larger army of the Roman Republic under the consuls Lucius, Aemilius, Paullus and Gaius Terentius Varro. It is regarded both as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history and as one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Having recovered from the losses at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, the Romans decided to engage Hannibal at Cannae, with roughly 86,000 Roman and allied troops. The Romans massed the heavy infantry in a deeper formation than usual, while Hannibal utilized the double envelopment tactic. This was so successful that the Roman army was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Following the defeat, Capua and several other Italian city-states defected from the Roman Republic to Carthage. Strategic background. Shortly after the start of the Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossed into Italy by traversing the Pyrenees and the Alps during the summer and early autumn. He quickly won major victories over the Romans at Trebia and at Lake Trasimene. After these losses, the Romans appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator to deal with the threat. Fabius used attrition warfare against Hannibal, cutting off his supply lines and avoiding pitched battles. These tactics proved unpopular with the Romans, who, as they recovered from the shock of Hannibal's victories, began to question the wisdom of the Fabian strategy, which had given the Carthaginian army a chance to regroup. The majority of Romans were eager to see a quick conclusion to the war. It was feared that, if Hannibal continued plundering Italy unopposed, Rome's allies might defect to the Carthaginian side for self-preservation. Therefore, when Fabius came to the end of his term, the Senate did not renew his dictatorial powers and command was given to consuls Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Marcus Atilius Regulus. In 216 BC, when elections resumed, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paullus were elected as consuls, placed in command of a newly raised army of unprecedented size, and directed to engage Hannibal. Polybius wrote, "The Senate determined to bring 8 legions into the field, which had never been done at Rome before, each legion consisting of 5,000 men besides allies. Most of the wars are decided by 1 consul and 2 legions, with the quota of allies, and they rarely employ all 4 at one time and on one service. But on this occasion, so great was the alarm and terror of what would happen, they resolved to bring not only 4 but 8 legions into the field." Estimates of Roman troop numbers. Rome typically employed 4 legions each year, each consisting of 4,000 foot soldiers and 200 cavalry. Perceiving the Carthaginian army as a real threat, for the first time ever the Senate introduced 8 legions, each legion consisting of 5,000 foot soldiers and 300 cavalry, with allied troops numbering the same amount of foot soldiers, but 900 cavalry per legion, triple the legion numbers. 8 legions, some 40,000 Roman soldiers and an estimated 2,400 cavalry, formed the nucleus of this massive new army. However, some have suggested that the destruction of an army of 90,000 troops would be impossible. They argue that Rome probably had 48,000 troops and 6,000 cavalry against Hannibal's 35,000 troops and 10,000 cavalry. Livy quotes one source stating the Romans added only 10,000 men to the usual army. While no definitive number of Roman troops exists, all sources agree that the Carthaginians faced a considerably larger foe. Roman command. Consuls were each assigned 2 of the 4 legions to command, rarely employing all 4 legions at once to the same assignment. However, The Senate feared a real threat and not only employed all 4 legions into the field, but all 8, including allies. Ordinarily, each of the 2 consuls would command his own portion of the army, but since the 2 armies were combined into one, Roman law required them to alternate the command on a daily basis. The traditional account puts Varro in command on the day of the battle, and much of the blame for the defeat has been laid on his shoulders. However, his low origins seem to be exaggerated in the sources, and Varro may have been made a scapegoat by the aristocratic establishment. Varro lacked the powerful descendants that Paullus had, descendants who were willing and able to protect his reputation. Most notably, Paullus was the grandfather of Scipio Aemilianus, the patron of Polybius. Prelude. In the spring of 216 BC, Hannibal took the initiative and seized the large supply depot at Cannae in the Apulian plain, placing himself between the Romans and their crucial source of supply. Hannibal recently harvested his crops, so he had a well-fed army ready for action in the city of Cannae. As Polybius noted, the capture of Cannae caused great commotion in the Roman army, for it was not only the loss of the place and the stores in it that distressed them, but the fact that it commanded the surrounding district. The consuls, resolving to confront Hannibal, marched southward in search of him. After 2 days' march, they found him on the left bank of the Varro.It river, and encamped 6 miles away. Reportedly, a Carthaginian officer named Gisgo commented on how much larger the Roman army was. Hannibal replied, "Another thing that has escaped your notice, Gisgo, is even more amazing, that although there are so many of them, there is not one among them called Gisgo." Varro, in command on the first day, is presented by contemporary sources as a man of reckless nature and hubris, who was determined to defeat Hannibal. While the Romans were approaching Cannae, a small portion of Hannibal's forces ambushed them. Varro successfully repelled the attack and continued on his way to Cannae. This victory, though essentially a mere skirmish with no lasting strategic value, greatly bolstered the confidence of the Roman army, perhaps too overconfidence on Varro's part. Paullus, however, was opposed to the engagement as it was taking shape. Unlike Varro, he was prudent and cautious, and he believed it was foolish to fight on open ground, despite the Romans' numerical strength. This was especially true since Hannibal held the advantage in cavalry. Despite these misgivings, Paullus thought it unwise to withdraw the army after the initial success, and camped 2/3 of the army east of the Varro.It river, sending the remainder to fortify a position on the opposite side. The purpose of this second camp was to cover the foraging parties from the main camp and harass those of the enemy. The 2 armies stayed in the respective locations for 2 days. During the second day, Hannibal, aware that Varro would be in command the following day, left his camp and offered battle, but Paullus refused. When his request was rejected, Hannibal, recognizing the importance of the water from the Varro.It to the Roman troops, sent his cavalry to the smaller Roman camp to harass water-bearing soldiers that were found outside the camp fortifications. According to Polybius, Hannibal's cavalry boldly rode up to the edge of the Roman encampment, causing havoc and thoroughly disrupting the supply of water to the Roman camp. Battle. Armies' figures for troops involved in ancient battles are often unreliable, and Cannae is no exception. Figures should be treated with caution, especially those for the Carthaginian side. The Carthaginian army was a combination of warriors from numerous regions, and may have numbered between 40,000 and 50,000. Along with the core of an estimated 8,000 Libyans, there were 8,000 Iberians, 16,000 Gauls and around 5,500 Gatulalian infantry. Hannibal's cavalry also came from diverse backgrounds. He commanded 4,000 Numidian, 2,000 Iberian, 4,000 Gallic and 450 Libya-Phoenician cavalry. Finally, Hannibal had around 8,000 skirmishers consisting of Balearic slingers and mixed-nationality spearmen. The uniting factor for the Carthaginian army was the personal tie each group had with Hannibal. The Roman forces totaled up to 79,000 men, 63,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, plus, in the two fortified camps, another 2,600 heavily armed men and 7,400 lightly armed men. Equipment: Rome's forces used typical Roman equipment including pila and haste as weapons, as well as traditional helmets, shields and body armor. On the other hand, the Carthaginian army used a variety of equipment. The Iberians fought with swords suited for cutting and thrusting, as well as javelins and various types of spears. For defense, Iberian warriors carried large oval shields and the falcata. The Gauls were likely wearing no armor, and the typical Gallic weapon was usually a long, slashing sword. The heavy Carthaginian cavalry carried 2 javelins and a curved slashing sword, with a heavy shield for protection. The Numidian cavalry were very lightly equipped, lacking saddles and bridles for the horses, and used no armor but carried small shields, javelins and possibly a knife, a longer blade. Skirmishers acting as light infantry carried either slings or spears. The Balearic slingers, who were famous for their accuracy, carried short, medium and long slings used to cast stones or bullets. They may have carried a small shield or simple leather pelt on their arms, but this is uncertain. Hannibal himself was wearing musculata armor and carried a falcata as well. The equipment of the Libyan line infantry has been much debated. Head has argued in favor of short-stabbing spears. Polybius states that the Libyans fought with equipment taken from previously defeated Romans. It is unclear whether he meant only shields and armor or offensive weapons as well, though a general reading suggests he meant the whole panoply of arms and armor, and even tactical organization. Apart from his description of the battle itself, when later discussing the subject of the Roman legion versus the Greek phalanx, Polybius says that, against Hannibal, the defeats they suffered had nothing to do with weapons or formations, because Hannibal himself discarded the equipment with which he had started out, armed his troops with Roman weapons. Daly is inclined to the view that Libyan infantry would have copied the Iberian use of the sword during the fighting there and so were armed similarly to the Romans. Connolly has argued that they were armed as a pike phalanx. This has been disputed by Head, because Plutarch states they carried spears shorter than the Roman trii, and by Daly because they could not have carried an unwieldy pike at the same time as a heavy Roman-style shield. Tactical deployment. The conventional deployment for armies of the time was placement of infantry in the center, with the cavalry in 2 flanking wings. The Romans followed this convention fairly closely, but chose extra depth rather than breadth for the infantry in hopes of breaking quickly through the center of Hannibal's line. Varro knew how the Roman infantry had managed to penetrate Hannibal's center at Trebia, and he planned to recreate this on an even greater scale. The Principes were stationed immediately behind the Hastati, ready to push forward at first contact to ensure the Romans presented a unified front. As Polybius wrote, the maniples were nearer each other, or the intervals were decreased. And the maniples showed more depth than front, even though they outnumbered the Carthaginians. This depth-oriented deployment meant that the Roman lines had a front of roughly equal size to the numerically inferior opponents. The typical style of ancient warfare was to continuously pour in infantry into the center and attempt to simply overpower the enemy. Hannibal understood that the Romans fought the battles like this, and he took his outnumbered army and strategically placed them around the enemy to win a tactical victory. To Varro, Hannibal seemed to have little room to maneuver and no means of retreat as he was deployed with the Aufidus River to his rear. The Varro believed that when pressed hard by the Romans' superior numbers, the Carthaginians would fall back to the river and, with no room to maneuver, would be cut down in panic. Bearing in mind that Hannibal's two previous victories had been largely decided by his trickery and ruse, Varro had sought an open battlefield. The field at Cannae was clear, with no possibility of hidden troops being brought to bear in an ambush. Hannibal, on the other hand, had deployed his forces based on the particular fighting qualities of each unit, taking into consideration both the strengths and weaknesses. This aspect of Hannibal's leadership was highlighted in the use of a Spanish unit, the Balearic Slingers, whom he placed behind the infantry to hurl the ranged missiles into the masses of Roman troops. He placed his Iberians and Gauls in the middle, alternating the ethnic composition across the front line, with himself at the front and center. Infantry from Punic Africa was on the wings at the very edge of his infantry line. These infantry were battle-hardened, remained cohesive and would attack the Roman flanks. Hasdrubal led the Iberian and Gaulish cavalry on the left of the Carthaginian army. By placing the flank of his army on the Aufidus River, Hannibal prevented this flank from being overlapped by the more numerous Romans. Hasdrubal was given about 6,500 cavalry, and Hanno had 3,500 Numidians on the right. Hannibal intended that his cavalry, comprising mainly medium Hispanic cavalry and Numidian light horse, and positioned on the flanks, would defeat the weaker Roman cavalry and swing around to attack the Roman infantry from the rear as it pressed upon Hannibal's weakened center. His veteran African troops would then press in from the flanks at the crucial moment and encircle the overextended Romans. The Romans were in front of the hill leading to Cannae and hemmed in on the right flank by the Aufidus River, so that the left flank was the only viable means of retreat. In addition, the Carthaginian forces had maneuvered so that the Romans would face east. Not only would the morning sun shine low into the Romans' eyes, but the southeasterly winds would blow sand and dust into their faces as they approached the battlefield. Hannibal's unique deployment of his army, based on his perception of the terrain and understanding of the capabilities of his troops, proved decisive. Battle as the armies advanced on one another, Hannibal gradually extended the center of his line, as Polybius described. After thus drawing up his whole army in a straight line, he took the central companies of Hispanics and Celts and advanced with them, keeping the rest of them in contact with these companies, but gradually falling off, so as to produce a crescent-shaped formation. The line of the flanking companies growing thinner as it was prolonged, his object being to employ the Africans as a reserve force and to begin the action with the Hispanics and Celts. Polybius described the weak Carthaginian center as deployed in a crescent, curving out toward the Romans in the middle with the African troops on the flanks in echelon formation. It is believed that the purpose of this formation was to break the forward momentum of the Roman infantry, and delay its advance before other developments allowed Hannibal to deploy his African infantry most effectively. While the majority of historians feel that Hannibal's action was deliberate, some have called this account fanciful, and claimed that the actions of the day represent either the natural curvature that occurs when a broad front of infantry marches forward, or the bending back of the Carthaginian center from the shock action of meeting the heavily massed Roman center. When the battle was joined, the cavalry engaged in a fierce exchange on the flanks. Polybius described the Hispanic and Celtic horse dismounting in what he considers a barbarian method of fighting. When the Hispanic and Gauls got the upper hand, they cut down the Roman cavalry without giving quarter. On the other flank, the Numidians engaged in a way that merely kept the Roman allied cavalry occupied. When the victorious Hispanic and Gallic cavalry came up, the allied cavalry broke and the Numidians pursued them off the field. While the Carthaginians were in the process of defeating the cavalry, the masses of infantry on both sides advanced towards each other in the center of the field. The wind from the east blew dust in the Romans' faces and obscured the vision. While the wind was not a major factor, the dust that both armies created would have been potentially debilitating to sight. Although it made seeing difficult, troops would still have been able to see others in the vicinity. The dust, however, was not the only psychological factor involved in battle. Because of the somewhat distant battle location, both sides were forced to fight on little sleep. Another Roman disadvantage was thirst caused by Hannibal's attack on the Roman encampment during the previous day. Furthermore, the massive number of troops would have led to an overwhelming amount of background noise. All of these psychological factors made battle especially difficult for the infantrymen. Hannibal stood with his men in the weak center and held them to a controlled retreat. The crescent of Hispanic and Gallic troops buckled inwards as they gradually withdrew. Knowing the superiority of the Roman infantry, Hannibal had instructed his infantry to withdraw deliberately, creating an even tighter semicircle around the attacking Roman forces. By doing so, he had turned the strength of the Roman infantry into a weakness. While the front ranks were gradually advancing, the bulk of the Roman troops began to lose their cohesion, as they began crowding themselves into the growing gap. Soon they were compacted together so closely that they had little space to wield the weapons. In pressing so far forward in the desire to destroy the retreating and seemingly collapsing line of Hispanic and Gallic troops, the Romans had ignored the African troops that stood uncommitted on the projecting ends of this now reverse crescent. This also gave the Carthaginian cavalry time to drive the Roman cavalry off on both flanks and attack the Roman center in the rear. The Roman infantry, now stripped of protection on both its flanks, formed a wedge that drove deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian semicircle, driving itself into an alley formed by the African infantry on the wings. At this decisive point, Hannibal ordered his African infantry to turn inwards and advance against the Roman flanks, creating an encirclement in one of the earliest known examples of a pincer movement. When the Carthaginian cavalry attacked the Romans in the rear and the African flanking echelons assailed them on the right and left, the advance of the Roman infantry was brought to an abrupt halt. The Romans were enclosed in a pocket with no means of escape. The Carthaginians created a wall and began destroying them. Polybius wrote, as the outer ranks were continually cut down, and the survivors forced to pull back and huddle together, they were finally all killed where they stood. As Livy described, so many thousands of Romans were dying. Some, whom the wounds, pinched by the morning cold, had roused, as they were rising up, covered with blood, for the midst of the heaps of slain, were overpowered by the enemy. Some were found with the heads plunged into the earth, which they had excavated, having thus, as it appeared, made pits for themselves, and having suffocated themselves. Cowley claims that nearly 600 legionaries were slaughtered each minute until darkness brought an end to the bloodletting. Only 14,000 Roman troops managed to escape, most of whom had cut the way through to the nearby town of Cannae. casualties. Roman Polybius writes that of the Roman and allied infantry, 70,000 were killed, 10,000 captured, and perhaps 3,000 survived. He also reports that of the 6,000 Roman and allied cavalry, only 370 survived. Livy wrote, 40,000 foot, 2,700 horse, there being an equal number of citizens and allies, are said to have been slain. Quote, he also reports that 3,000 Roman and allied infantry and 1,500 Roman and allied cavalry were taken prisoner by the Carthaginians. Although Livy does not cite his source by name, it is likely to have been Quintus Fabius Pictor, a Roman historian who fought in and wrote on the Second Punic War. It is Pictor whom Livy names when reporting the casualties at the Battle of Trebia. In addition to the consul Paullus, Livy goes on to record that among the dead were 2 quaestors, 29 of the 48 in military tribunes, and 80 senators, and men who had held offices which would have given them the right to be elected to the Senate. Later Roman and Greco-Roman historians largely follow Livy's figures. Appian gave 50,000 killed and a great many taken prisoner. Plutarch agreed 50,000 Romans fell in that battle. 4,000 were taken alive. Quintilian, 60,000 men were slain by Hannibal at Cannae. Eutropius, 20 officers of consular and praetorian rank, 30 senators, and 300 others of noble descent, were taken or slain, as well as 40,000 foot soldiers, and 3,500 horse. Some modern historians, while rejecting Polybius's figure as flawed, are willing to accept Livy's figure. Some more recent historians have come up with far lower estimates. Cantilupe proposed Roman losses of 10,500 to 16,000. Samuels also regards Livy's figure as far too high, on the grounds that the cavalry would have been inadequate to prevent the Roman infantry escaping to the rear. He doubts that Hannibal even wanted a high death toll, as much of the army consisted of Italians whom Hannibal hoped to win as allies. Carthaginian Livy recorded Hannibal's losses at about 8,000 of his bravest men. Polybius reports 5,700 dead, 4,000 Gauls, 1,500 Spanish and Africans, and 200 cavalry.